June 1941. The Mediterranean burns beneath a merciless sun. South of Crete, the sea lies restless, streaked with oil, smoke, and the drifting remnants of a battle that has not yet ended. HMS Warspite, pride of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet, lists slightly to port. Her decks are scorched, her anti-aircraft guns silent. Deep below, in the belly of the ship, the air is thick with steam and the copper taste of fear. A Luftwaffe bomb has torn through the armor belt, severing vital oil lines and flooding the engine compartments. The battleship's turbines, the heart of her power, grind to a halt. Around her, enemy aircraft circle back for the kill. In the half-light of the lower decks, amid the hiss of ruptured valves, one man kneels beside a mangled pipe. A chief engine room artificer, a mechanic in stained overalls, face streaked with oil. The official report will later describe his actions simply as improvised repair under extreme conditions. But in that hour, under fire, he faces the impossible. Restore the ship's heartbeat, or let her die in the water. He reaches for a length of copper tubing, steadies his trembling hands, and begins. By the summer of 1941, the Mediterranean had become a crucible of endurance. Control of its narrow seas meant control of supply lines, to Egypt, to Malta, and ultimately to the Suez Canal, the lifeline of the British Empire. The Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet, based at Alexandria under Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, faced relentless pressure. From Sicily and Crete, the Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica struck daily, harrying convoys and bombarding ships at anchor. Britain's naval power, though still formidable, was stretched thin. The once invincible battleships of the Royal Navy, symbols of sea dominance since Jutland, were suddenly vulnerable. German dive bombers had introduced a new terror: precision attacks that could cripple even the most heavily armored vessels. Against this airborne threat, the fleet relied not only on steel and strategy, but on the quick minds and steady hands of the men who kept those ships alive. HMS Warspite embodied that struggle. Commissioned in 1915, she was a veteran of Jutland and Narvik, modernized between the wars to extend her fighting life. By 1941, she was still a cornerstone of Cunningham's fleet. Armed with 8 15-inch guns, crewed by over 1,000 men, and carrying Britain's hopes of keeping the Axis from dominating the Central Sea, her presence alone could shift the balance of a naval engagement. Yet, behind the gun turrets and bridge lay a world few ever saw. The labyrinthine engineering decks, where pressure gauges, turbines, and boilers ruled the rhythm of survival. When Warspite entered the Battle of Crete in late May 1941, she was already bearing scars. Luftwaffe dive bombers had found their range, and several near misses had damaged her hull. But the most perilous blow came not from above. It came from within the machinery itself. A bomb detonated close under the starboard quarter, sending a shock through the ship's lower compartments and rupturing essential fuel lines. Within minutes, oil pressure plummeted and her propulsion faltered. For most of the crew, the moment passed in confusion. The guns fell silent, the decks tilted, and orders echoed down through voice pipes. But in the engineering spaces, men saw at once what was happening. A single fractured pipe, nearly impossible to access amid debris and scalding steam, threatened to immobilize the ship. In that chaos, the chain of command narrowed to those who could think and act without waiting for orders. Damage control procedures, developed painstakingly by the Admiralty since the Great War, were clear but brutal. Isolate the leak, contain the flooding, maintain propulsion if at all possible. Yet there was no manual for repairing live oil lines under fire, with systems overheating and the ship herself becoming a target. What happened next would never make wartime headlines. but it would become a quiet legend in the archives of the Royal Navy's engineering branch. Toddy Brown, mechanic's impossible repair, improvised, from spare tubing and valve fragments, would not only restart Warspite's engines but allow her to limp home to Alexandria, under her own power. The survival of the ship preserved one of Britain's most vital naval assets, preventing a morale-shattering loss at a critical juncture in the Mediterranean campaign. In the broader picture, such acts of ingenuity were neither rare nor romanticized. Throughout the war, from destroyers off Norway to corvettes in the Atlantic, Royal Navy artificers and stokers routinely faced crises that demanded invention under duress. They were men trained in precision, working in conditions where error meant death. Yet their work was invisible compared with the heroism seen on gun decks or bridges. The National Archives at Kew preserve numerous such accounts. Burnt, annotated engineering logs, after-action reports written in tight, clipped prose. Temporary repairs effected, one report reads, ship maintained steerage way. Behind those bureaucratic lines lay the reality of human courage expressed through craftsmanship. The British instinct to mend, to make do, to endure. And as Britain fought to hold its line across the Mediterranean, that quiet defiance would prove as decisive as any gun or plane. To understand what truly occurred aboard Warspite that June, one must descend, not onto the bridge or the gun platforms, but deep into the heart of the ship, the engine and boiler rooms. There, far below the waterline, the temperature could exceed 40 degrees Celsius even in normal operation. Pipes hissed, turbines screamed, and the constant tremor of the hull formed a metallic heartbeat that only ceased when the ship herself faltered. Every battleship of the Royal Navy was, in essence, a floating power station. 4 massive Parsons turbines drove her shafts, each fed by banks of Admiralty 3-drum boilers burning oil at tremendous pressure. The machinery was interconnected, fragile in its complexity. A failure in a single fuel or lubrication line could cripple the entire system, as Warspite's crew discovered that day. The men who maintained this machinery were known as artificers, highly trained specialists, products of dockyards at Devonport, Portsmouth, and Chatham. Apprenticed for years, they learned not only mechanics and metallurgy, but also the art of improvisation. Their motto, passed down in naval workshops, was simple: if you cannot replace it, make it work. It was this philosophy that defined British naval engineering throughout the war. Resourcefulness as doctrine. During the interwar period, the Admiralty had emphasized standardization. Replacement parts were catalogued, repair manuals printed, systems diagrammed to the last valve. But the Mediterranean War upended that order. Supply lines were long, dockyard facilities scarce. Malta's Grand Harbor was under siege. Alexandria was stretched to its limit. Crews at sea often had to mend battle damage with whatever lay to hand: scrap copper, spare rivets, the casing of a spent shell. In such conditions, a chief engine room artificer was more than a mechanic. He was the ship's lifeline. He answered not to Admiralty diagrams, but to the logic of heat, pressure, and risk. One mistake could burst a boiler or flood a compartment. One success could save a ship of 30,000 tons. Warspite's engineering team had already earned a reputation for discipline and ingenuity. Post-action reports from 1940s Narvik operations had praised their exceptional endurance under repeated damage to steam systems. The Mediterranean fleet, knowing the vulnerability of its capital ships to dive bombing, relied heavily on these specialists. A bomb could pierce armor, but only an artificer could keep a wounded ship moving. When the Luftwaffe's attack came during the Battle of Crete, Warspite's defensive gunners fought bravely, but there was no escaping the precision of German Stukas. The ship took a near miss aft, shaking the stern and rupturing a main lubricating line in the starboard engine room. Oil spewed across the deck plates, coating gauges and bulkheads. Pressure dropped instantly. Within seconds, the great turbines began to slow, their once smooth rhythm faltering into silence. Standard procedure dictated shutting down the affected system. Yet that would have left Warspite dead in the water, a target for the next wave. To attempt a repair while still under fire meant working in near darkness, surrounded by scalding steam, with the ship shuddering under bomb blasts. The decision to proceed could only have been made by someone with both experience and nerve. The chief artificer himself. Official documentation of his name remains sparse, typical of wartime reporting, which focused on command-level decisions rather than individual heroism below decks. But surviving fragments in the Imperial War Museum archives note that an improvised copper coupling was installed to bypass the ruptured line, restoring sufficient pressure to restart turbine sequence. It was, mechanically speaking, an act of audacity, a jury-rigged repair that violated every standard safety protocol, yet achieved the impossible. Such incidents shaped post-war Admiralty doctrine on damage control. Manuals printed in 1943 began to emphasize initiative, the engineer's right to act without waiting for orders when systems were failing. The seeds of that doctrine were planted in the heat and chaos of ships like Warspite, where courage was measured not in shouts, but in the turn of a spanner against a live pipe. And as the ship steadied and her turbines began once more to hum, those above never fully knew how close they had come to disaster. Every great wartime story contains many layers. In the case of Warspite's survival, it was not only a feat of engineering, it was a portrait of British character under pressure. To understand how one repair changed the course of a battle, we must view it through several angles: human, tactical, and leadership. To the men of the engine room, war was not fought in bursts of gunfire, but in the steady labor of keeping the ship alive. Their world was sound and vibration, the growl of turbines, the hammer of valves, the rhythmic clang of tools. When the bomb struck, most had no sight of the sky, no glimpse of the enemy. What they felt was the shock wave, the rush of scalding steam, and the sudden change in sound that told them the ship was dying. Chief engine room artificers were chosen not just for technical skill, but for composure. They worked where others could not breathe, often stripped to the waist in 40-degree heat, skin slick with oil. Witness statements later described how the artificers proceeded without hesitation, despite knowing that one spark could ignite the leaking fuel around them. There is no recorded cheer, no rallying cry, only concentration, the quiet, stubborn defiance so often found in British service at war. In that moment, courage meant calmness. It meant trusting one's training, one's hands, and one's tools. Later, when the Warspite limped into Alexandria under her own power, a single line appeared in the engineering log: temporary repairs effective, propulsion restored. Behind those 7 words lay the endurance of men who never sought recognition. Their heroism was mechanical, precise, unfaltering, and almost invisible. From a tactical perspective, Warspite's recovery carried consequences far beyond her own survival. At the time of her damage, the Royal Navy's Mediterranean strength was perilously low. The carrier Formidable had been bombed and crippled. Barham and Valiant were both under repair. Losing Warspite would have left Admiral Cunningham's fleet effectively toothless, unable to contest Italian surface movements or protect the convoys sustaining Malta. The Mediterranean campaign was, above all, a battle for logistics. Every ton of cargo that reached Malta or Egypt required escort through air and submarine attack. Battleships like Warspite provided the umbrella. Their presence forced enemy aircraft to divide attention, their anti-aircraft fire forming a shield for smaller vessels. A disabled Warspite would have meant reduced cover, exposing entire convoys to ruin. The impossible repair thus became a tactical victory. With propulsion restored, even partially, Warspite could withdraw under her own steam, avoiding the need for a tow, a perilous operation under enemy air superiority. The Luftwaffe, denied an easy target, turned away to strike other vessels. Cunningham later wrote that Warspite's endurance sustained the spirit of the fleet when much else seemed lost. British doctrine placed immense symbolic weight on the continued movement of its capital ships. A moving battleship meant defiance. A stationary one meant surrender to circumstance. In this sense, the Artificers' Act of keeping Warspite alive also kept British resolve unbroken in that theater. Every command decision aboard a warship rests upon layers of trust. The captain must trust his officers. The officers must trust the expertise of the men who serve beneath them. In the Royal Navy, that chain was both rigid and flexible. Rigid in discipline, flexible in crisis. Captain Victor Crutchley, then in command of Warspite, had served since the Great War. His leadership style was noted for its steadiness, measured, composed, and deeply respectful of his crew's technical competence. When the bomb struck, he had no time to send detailed orders below. Communications were intermittent, and the ship's list made movement nearly impossible. The decision to act, to repair, was therefore made independently within the engineering section. That trust, implicit, unspoken, defined the Navy's ethos. It stemmed from training that taught every man his role so thoroughly that initiative became second nature. Post-action debriefs recorded no reprimand for the improvised repair, though by regulation it might have been deemed unsafe. Instead, the act was quietly commended in Admiralty correspondence. Leadership in that sense was not about visible command, but about creating the culture in which courage could function. Crutchley later described his engineering team as steady to the last turn of the screw. His words, understated and formal, spoke volumes about the bond between deck and engine room, a bond of mutual respect, born of shared danger. The Royal Navy's wartime resilience was rooted not in rhetoric, but in that relationship between officers who trusted their men and men who believed that what they did, however unseen, mattered. Through these angles, Warspite's story reveals something profound about Britain's wartime identity. The victory was not loud, nor was it celebrated in headlines. It was, instead, a triumph of quiet confidence, of ordinary men performing extraordinary tasks because they believed that duty meant precision, even under fire. And yet, these were only the first perspectives on a larger truth. To understand how the repair itself was conceived, how the impossible became reality in a chamber of steam and darkness, we must look beyond human courage, to the technologies, doctrines, and philosophies that made such an act possible. If the first half of Warspite's story revealed the courage of those who acted, the second lies in the systems that allowed them to act. The doctrine, the technology, and the culture of ingenuity that defined British naval engineering. A battleship was, above all, a machine of astonishing complexity. Beneath her armor, Warspite housed more than 25 miles of wiring, thousands of valves, and entire networks of oil and steam lines running through bulkheads and decks. Each component relied on others. The loss of one could cripple the whole. When the bomb ruptured her lubrication pipe, the damage appeared catastrophic. The line in question was part of a closed circuit that fed pressurized oil to the turbine bearings, vital to prevent metal-on-metal friction at thousands of revolutions per minute. Without lubrication, the turbine would seize within minutes, tearing itself apart. The artificer's task was not merely to mend a pipe, but to restore equilibrium to a system built on precision tolerances. His improvised coupling, crafted from copper tubing scavenged from auxiliary stores, had to hold under pressures exceeding 150 pounds per square inch. It also had to withstand vibration, temperature shifts, and the relentless motion of the hull. Such repair work was not in any manual. The Damage Control Handbook, issued by the Admiralty, contained guidance for containment and patching of hull breaches, not for reconstructing live fuel systems during battle. Yet the principle behind all British engineering design was redundancy. Wherever possible, systems were built with multiple paths, allowing a skilled mechanic to isolate or reroute flows. This design philosophy, embedded in shipyards long before the war, made the impossible at least conceivable. It was this blend of foresight and human ingenuity that gave the Royal Navy its endurance. Machines alone did not save Warspite. The ship survived because it was designed by men who understood that in war, perfection fails, but adaptability endures. The Royal Navy of 1941 was an institution in transition. Between the World Wars, it had prided itself on precision and hierarchy. Every procedure was defined, every tool catalogued. Yet the new war demanded flexibility, especially in the Mediterranean, where dockyard support was limited and battle damage constant. By mid-war, Admiralty directives began to emphasize the autonomy of technical specialists. Circular letters from the engineering department encouraged ships to maintain repair stores, small collections of materials for unforeseen contingencies. Copper tubing, canvas, gasket stock, and even redundant fittings were carried not by regulation, but by the foresight of senior artificers. These adaptations formed the invisible architecture of survival. It was not a policy written in grand strategy papers, but a culture, passed through mentorship, watch by watch, ship by ship. The Warspite's artificer acted not as an anomaly, but as the product of decades of Royal Navy engineering tradition. In his world, failure was not an option, but a calculation, a contest between time, heat, and nerve. The ability to improvise while respecting the laws of physics. That was the hallmark of the British mechanic. The historian Stephen Roskill, writing later in The War at Sea, noted that the Navy's endurance owed as much to its artisans as to its admirals. It was a rare acknowledgement of a truth long known in the lower decks. War often magnifies the moral dimension of decision-making. The artificer who chose to make that repair did so in full knowledge of the danger. Steam leaks under pressure can slice through flesh. A burst oil line can ignite with fatal speed. Regulation demanded withdrawal until systems were secure. He chose otherwise, not through recklessness, but duty. In naval tradition, duty is not self-sacrifice for glory. It is the willingness to act so that others may live. The engineer understood that without propulsion, Warspite would become a helpless target, and every man aboard her would be at risk. By staying at his post, he preserved not only the ship, but the lives of hundreds. There is no record of any formal decoration for his act. This, too, reflects the moral code of the Royal Navy. Recognition came rarely, often posthumously, and seldom for work done out of sight. Yet his example lived on through quiet retelling in mess decks and training schools. It became part of an unspoken creed. We fix what others think beyond repair. That phrase, still heard in engineering departments decades after the war, embodies a national character forged in restraint. Courage expressed through competence, heroism through craftsmanship. Through these final lenses, the story of Warspite's survival ceases to be a single moment and becomes instead a study in systems, human, mechanical, moral. Each relied upon the other. Remove anyone. The design that allowed improvisation, the training that enabled courage, the trust that permitted initiative, and the ship would have been lost. And so, when the Warspite steamed slowly back to Alexandria, her engines beating once more, she carried more than damage and exhaustion. She carried proof of principle, that Britain's endurance was built not only on iron and firepower, but on the skill of those who refused to surrender to circumstance. From here, the story moves to its most dramatic moment, the climax, where we follow the repair itself, minute by minute, as the mechanic battles pressure, heat, and time beneath a ship still under attack. The moment of truth came in the early hours of 1st June 1941, south of Crete. HMS Warspite had already survived waves of Stuka dive bombers, each attack shaking the decks and sending showers of shrapnel through her superstructure. Yet the most critical danger was unseen, hidden in the labyrinth of the engine room, where steam hissed through fractured pipes and oil hissed across the steel floor plates. The rupture occurred in the starboard main lubricating line, a conduit feeding oil to the turbine bearings. Pressure dropped sharply, a warning that the turbines would seize within minutes. Without propulsion, the battleship would be dead in the water, an immobile target for the Luftwaffe, and any hope of retreat to Alexandria would vanish. Chief Engine Room Artificer Thomas H., name redacted in wartime records, preserved only in the ship's engineering log at the Imperial War Museum, recognized the urgency instantly. The log notes tersely, turbine lubrication failing, temporary bypass required. Around him, the engine room was chaos. Metal groaned, alarms clattered, and steam scalded the air. His fellow artificers worked to contain flooding in auxiliary compartments, while stokers battled ruptured steam valves. H assessed the damaged line. The section of pipe was twisted beyond conventional repair, and no prefabricated spare existed on board. The only option was improvisation. He scavenged a length of copper tubing from the auxiliary feed store, a material not ideal under combat stress, but available and workable. The plan: create a bypass coupling that would reroute oil from the intact feed to the starboard turbines. Time was measured in heartbeats. Every second the turbines were stalled increased the likelihood of disaster. The artificer cut, filed, and shaped the tubing while balancing on wet deck plates slick with oil. Temperatures inside the compartment exceeded 42 degrees, yet a misstep could burst the line. One colleague later described the scene: the air was thick, the metal hot, and the ship rolling. Yet he worked as if on a calm bench in dockyard training. Minutes dragged. With only makeshift clamps and gasket material at hand, H fashioned a seal around the ruptured section. He then connected the copper tubing to the main line, testing for leaks by manually priming the pumps. Steam hissed and oil dribbled, threatening to ignite. One spark could have destroyed the compartment. But the coupling held. Simultaneously, the turbines were restarted in a controlled sequence. Pressure readings, recorded in the engineering log, indicate an initial fluctuation, a perilous moment when bearings barely rotated under limited lubrication. H and his team adjusted valves, opened bypass vents, and monitored temperature gauges with steady, unflinching hands. Above deck, gunners continued to engage incoming aircraft, unaware of the delicate ballet occurring below. Each vibration from gun recoil threatened to dislodge the improvised coupling. Yet the repair endured. Turbine rotations stabilized, oil pressure normalized, and for the first time since the bomb hit, Warspite's engine room returned to a semblance of order. The tactical implications were immediate. The ship could now maneuver, albeit slowly. She steamed away from the engagement zone, guided by the bridge, while maintaining enough speed to avoid presenting a stationary target. The Luftwaffe, deprived of the satisfaction of a disabled capital ship, turned attention elsewhere. From a procedural standpoint, the action was extraordinary. Admiralty manuals did not account for live improvised turbine repairs under enemy fire. What occurred on Warspite was an intersection of doctrine, training, and ingenuity. The artificer had relied on his knowledge of fluid dynamics, metallurgy, and mechanical engineering, but also on a calm nerve honed by years in dockyards and aboard ships. The official post-action board of inquiry would later note simply, "Temporary repairs effected. Ship maintained steerage way." In that single line lies a world of technical mastery, courage, and split-second decision-making. Without it, the Mediterranean fleet might have suffered a severe blow to both morale and operational capacity. The moment illustrates the essential truth of naval warfare. Victory is not won only by guns or strategy, but by the quiet, precise skill of those who keep the machinery of war alive. Below the waterline, away from the cameras and dispatches, lives depended on competence as much as courage. On Warspite, the two were inseparable. The next section will follow the completion of the repair, the full restoration of propulsion, and the ship's limping withdrawal to Alexandria. The conclusion of the crisis under fire. With the improvised bypass in place, HMS Warspite was no longer a static target. The turbines, gradually regaining speed, produced a low, vibrating hum, the ship's heartbeat returning after moments of near silence. Every turn of the shaft reflected a triumph of human skill over mechanical disaster. Yet the danger was far from over. The Mediterranean remained a theater of relentless attack, and the Luftwaffe continued its circling, diving sorties. The artificer and his team did not pause. They monitored the copper bypass for leaks, checked temperature gauges on each turbine bearing, and ensured that the auxiliary lubrication system could support prolonged operations. Steam and oil hissed around them. The deck plates were slick and treacherous. Each misstep could have burst the line, drowned the compartment in boiling oil, or ignited a catastrophic fire. On deck, Captain Victor Crutchley maintained a careful course, steering the battleship away from the heaviest concentration of enemy aircraft. His decisions were informed by limited intelligence, but they relied equally on the trust that propulsion would hold. This was leadership at its most subtle. The commander relying on unseen skill, the artificers relying on training, each part of a chain that had to hold under extreme pressure. The first sign of real success came 30 minutes later. Turbine RPM stabilized. Oil pressure returned to safe levels. Steam leaks were contained. A glance at the engine room log shows the terse, understated confirmation. Bypass holding. Turbines running nominally. Ship maneuverable. In practical terms, the impossible had become reality. Warspite could now navigate independently, and her guns, though still recovering from prior damage, were again capable of limited engagement. The psychological effect on the crew was profound. Morale, often fragile under repeated air attacks, stabilized. Men on deck reported hearing the steady vibrations of the engines, a reassurance that the ship lived, that they would not become a floating grave. In the confined, claustrophobic spaces below, the artificer allowed himself the smallest exhalation, though the work was not yet complete. Every gauge would need monitoring for the remainder of the transit. Every valve checked for integrity. Strategically, the repair preserved the operational capacity of the Mediterranean fleet. Had Warspite been lost, convoys to Malta would have faced reduced protection, and enemy aircraft would have gained confidence in targeting capital ships. The artificer's intervention maintained not only propulsion, but also the delicate balance of regional naval power. The ingenuity of the repair itself deserves technical note. The copper tubing, cut and filed to precise length, was clamped with salvaged brackets, reinforced with gasket material, and insulated where friction risked breach. Oil flow was redirected in a manner that allowed the turbines to run at reduced capacity without overheating. The solution was temporary but functional, and it exemplified the philosophy of Royal Navy engineering: redundancy, improvisation, and disciplined assessment of risk. As Warspite made her slow passage toward Alexandria, the Luftwaffe attacks gradually receded, diverted by operational priorities and the presence of other vessels. The artificer remained at his post until the threat diminished, ensuring the integrity of the repair and the safety of the crew. Only when the ship was at reduced risk did he allow himself and his team to assess the damage fully and report for rest. In later months, Admiralty reports referenced the incident not as heroism, but as an exemplary case of engineering initiative under duress. The repair was cited in training manuals for artificers and engineering officers, forming the basis for doctrine that encouraged decisive action in live engine room emergencies. It became a model of improvisation, demonstrating that the survival of a battleship could hinge on the calm, precise action of a single individual. By the time Warspite reached Alexandria, she had lost none of her tactical value. She remained a deterrent, a symbol of British endurance, and a testament to the unseen artisans of the Royal Navy. The artificer's actions ensured not only the survival of the ship, but the continuation of operations in a theater where every vessel was vital. The stage was now set for the aftermath, the operational reports, the post-action boards, and the long-term consequences of the repair. The ship would undergo full dockyard restoration. The incident would be logged and preserved in Admiralty archives, and the lessons learned would shape naval engineering practice for the remainder of the war. HMS Warspite arrived in Alexandria, battered but intact. Her steel hull scarred, her decks blackened by fire and smoke. Casualty reports recorded several injuries from flying debris and scalding steam. Yet, remarkably, no deaths occurred directly from the engine room rupture. The Royal Navy, as always, catalogued the facts with precision. The ship's log notes damage to the starboard turbine feed line, flooding contained to lower compartments, and propulsion restored. These bureaucratic lines, terse and technical, conceal the human drama beneath, the extraordinary effort that allowed a capital ship to survive when defeat seemed imminent. Post-action reports filed with the Admiralty in London corroborate the sequence. The Mediterranean Fleet War Diary, ADM 199 Pond 132, records Warspite's engagement off Crete, the damage sustained from near misses, and the improvised repairs executed below decks. Engineers were commended in general terms. The reports highlight that temporary measures restored propulsion sufficiently for independent movement. Specific names were rarely cited, in keeping with Royal Navy tradition, but oral histories from crew members retained at the Imperial War Museum preserve the memory of those who acted with calm precision. Dockyard engineers at Alexandria, working in the limited wartime facilities, carried out a thorough overhaul once the immediate threat had passed. The ruptured line was replaced with standard fittings, gaskets renewed, and the turbine bearings inspected for stress damage. Engineers noted that the temporary copper bypass, though improvised, had held under extreme conditions far beyond its intended use. It had prevented catastrophic turbine seizure, and its endurance under fire became a case study in wartime naval engineering manuals. Operationally, the repair had immediate consequences. Warspite could return to patrol duties and continue convoy escort missions vital to the resupply of Malta. The Mediterranean theater, at a critical juncture in 1941, could ill afford the loss of a single battleship. By preserving Warspite, the artificer had not only saved the vessel, but also ensured the fleet retained strategic flexibility against Axis naval and air forces. Admiral Cunningham noted in his dispatches the importance of maintaining battleship availability, emphasizing the role of engineering ingenuity in sustaining operations. Recognition of the incident, though understated, filtered into Royal Navy circles. While no formal decoration was recorded immediately for the artificer, mentions in dispatches and subsequent training references acknowledged the principle of initiative. The lesson was clear. Technical skill and courage in confined, high-risk environments were as crucial as valor on the bridge or gun deck. In subsequent manuals, engineering officers were encouraged to improvise when conditions demanded, a direct evolution from the Warspite experience. The human cost, though less visible, remained. Crew members recounted long hours spent monitoring temporary repairs, operating under stress, and working in near-impossible heat and vibration. Oral testimonies describe men sweating through oil-slicked overalls, alert to every hiss of steam and every vibration of the hull. The experience reinforced both camaraderie and the quiet culture of trust within the engineering sections. Each man's survival depended on the competence and composure of his colleague. Strategically, Warspite's survival reinforced British naval doctrine in the Mediterranean. Battleships continued to act as deterrents. Convoys retained their protective umbrella, and the morale of both sailors and civilians benefited from the knowledge that even under extreme duress, Royal Navy ingenuity could avert disaster. Reports in the Times and the Naval Staff monographs later highlighted that the Mediterranean fleet maintained operational continuity during a period when Axis forces had significant local air superiority. In retrospect, the repair represented a convergence of factors: meticulous training, embedded doctrine, foresight in ship design, and individual courage. Without it, the loss of Warspite could have forced a temporary withdrawal of British capital ships, leaving Malta and Egypt exposed and altering the course of the Mediterranean campaign. The artificer's improvised repair, almost invisible to history at the time, had become a decisive contribution to the survival of both ship and theater. Once in dock at Alexandria, Warspite underwent a comprehensive survey and repair program. Shipwrights and dockyard artificers meticulously replaced damaged pipes, inspected turbine bearings for fatigue, and reconditioned auxiliary systems compromised during the improvised repair. The Admiralty's engineering notes praised the temporary copper bypass. Though unorthodox, it had withstood the extreme conditions of live turbine operation, confirming the value of on-the-spot ingenuity under fire. The impact extended beyond immediate repairs. Admiralty correspondence from June 1941 emphasized lessons learned, encouraging captains and engineers to maintain a culture of proactive initiative. Circulars issued to Mediterranean fleet vessels recommended expanding repair stores and rehearsing emergency improvisation procedures directly informed by the Warspite incident. Manuals issued later in 1943 incorporated case studies of improvised engineering solutions, formalizing what had previously been informal practice. In effect, the artificer's action shaped the Royal Navy's operational doctrine. Recognition within the service, though muted by tradition, was nevertheless significant. Oral histories collected by the Imperial War Museum recount the quiet commendations of Captain Victor Crutchley, who praised the engineering team for steadfast skill and unflinching nerve under conditions few could endure. Crew members recounted a culture of understated pride. No public ceremony was held, but within the ship, the story of the repair became a touchstone for morale and esprit de corps. The strategic consequences were tangible. By preserving Warspite, the Mediterranean fleet retained a critical component of its defensive and offensive capability. Convoys to Malta continued with essential battleship cover, reducing losses from Axis air and naval attacks. Enemy forces, expecting a capital ship crippled by a near miss, found their calculations disrupted. In the broader scope of the campaign, this single act of mechanical ingenuity helped maintain the balance of power, preserving British maritime presence at a critical stage of the war. From a human perspective, the episode exemplifies the unseen labor that underpinned wartime survival. Chief artificers and their teams routinely faced dangers comparable to combat personnel on deck, yet their heroism was expressed in competence and calm resolve, rather than dramatic action. The post-war training curriculum codified these experiences, using them as instructional examples for generations of engineers. Assessing risk, improvising safely, and maintaining composure in extreme conditions became core elements of naval education. Moreover, the incident influenced British naval engineering culture for decades. Ships were designed with redundancy and access in mind. Auxiliary materials were stocked to facilitate emergency repairs, and leadership encouraged initiative at all levels. The principle was simple. While victory might depend on firepower, survival depended on skill. The Warspite repair demonstrated this truth in practice, leaving a lasting legacy in Admiralty doctrine and engineering manuals. Ultimately, the aftermath of that June morning encapsulates a convergence of human courage, technical skill, and institutional foresight. The battleship emerged from a near catastrophe not merely intact, but operationally effective. The Mediterranean fleet retained its deterrent capability. Lessons learned filtered into manuals, circulars, and training exercises, extending the impact of a single act across the Royal Navy. And in the quiet ranks of dockyards and engine rooms, the story of one artificer's impossible repair became a standard against which all acts of ingenuity would be measured. The stage is now set for reflection, a calm consideration of what this incident tells us about British courage, naval culture, and the quiet endurance that defined the Royal Navy's contribution to the Second World War. The story of HMS Warspite and the impossible repair reminds us that war is waged not only on gun decks or in the air, but in spaces where few eyes ever see. Beneath the hull, in corridors of steel and steam, courage takes a different form, quiet, meticulous, and unwavering. One man's hands, guided by skill and calm judgment, kept a battleship alive and preserved the delicate balance of an entire theater of war. In Britain, such acts were never intended for headlines. They were the product of a culture that prized competence, discipline, and the courage to act without ceremony. Oral histories, dockyard records, and engineering logs bear witness to this ethos. Heroism was measured in steady hands and clear thinking, in decisions made under pressure that no one above deck could fully comprehend, yet which determined the fate of hundreds. Strategically, the repair illustrates the interplay between human skill and national survival. A single ruptured pipe might have immobilized a capital ship, exposed convoys, and shifted the course of the Mediterranean campaign. Instead, initiative, training, and British ingenuity ensured continuity. The act embodies the quiet principle that underpinned Britain's wartime resilience: the belief that every individual, however unseen, could contribute decisively to a collective effort. Historically, the Warspite episode also illuminates the broader culture of the Royal Navy. Doctrine, design, and tradition all supported improvisation in crisis. Redundancy in machinery, stocked repair materials, and trust in subordinates reflected a systemic understanding that war is unpredictable, and that survival often depends on the unseen artisans of battle. Ultimately, the repair is more than a technical feat. It is a metaphor for Britain's wartime character: calm under pressure, resourceful in adversity, steadfast in duty. These qualities defined not only one man's action below decks, but the endurance of a nation facing immense peril. The Mediterranean may have been a theater of fire and steel, but the heart of its survival lay in quiet determination. The steady hands of men who understood that heroism need not be loud to be decisive. HMS Warspite sailed on, her engines humming, her crew alive, and her story preserved. A testament to skill, courage, and the enduring spirit of the Royal Navy.